Before I start today's video, I just want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to everyone who watches the videos, to those of you who have taken the time to subscribe to the channel, and for all your comments, likes and shares. This really does help to keep the community growing. I would also like to give an extra special shout out to the amazing channel members, whose names are all appearing on screen. Your support goes above and beyond, and I'm very grateful to all of you. If anyone would like to become a channel member, there is a link below the description. But now please just sit back as we look at 4 cases from 4 different countries. Case 1 comes from late 19th century Australia. Ellen Lynch was born in the small town of Mallow in County Cork in Ireland. In 1846, this period was marked by the Great Famine, a devastating event in Irish history that resulted in widespread suffering. The potato crop failure in Ireland had far-reaching and tragic consequences. Mass starvation, disease and death swept across the country, and this resulted in a significant population decline due to emigration and the high mortality rates. The famine also escalated tensions between the Irish people and the British authorities due to inadequate relief efforts and policies that only worsened the crisis. Ellen's family, like many others, was caught in the grip of this catastrophe, and although little is known about her early childhood, it can be assumed that she endured the hardships and challenges that came with living in Ireland in the mid-19th century. The Great Famine had a profound impact on her family and countless others, and following the death of her father, her mother, named Mrs. Mary Lynch, made the decision to leave Ireland. On the 6th of April 1858, along with her 2 daughters, Mrs. Lynch boarded a ship named Joshua and sailed to the Australian colony of New South Wales, where she was reunited with her sister, who had already settled there and lived in the small town of Goulburn, which is about 120 miles southwest of Sydney. When Mrs. Lynch and her daughters arrived in Australia, they were confronted with the challenging task of building a new life in a new and unfamiliar land. However, they were part of a larger wave of immigrants who during this period had been drawn by the promise of fertile land, economic prospects, and the hope of a brighter future. The 2 girls did not go to school. Education had not been compulsory when they were young children in Ireland, and it was not until the Education Act of 1870 was passed that schooling became compulsory in Australia. Instead of going to school, Ellen found employment. She worked hard in order to help her mother. She was polite, and Mrs. Lynch was often told that she had brought up 2 very respectable daughters. When Ellen was still a teenager, she married Mr. William Woods, and over the next few years gave birth to 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. Tragically, the firstborn, a little girl named Victoria, died of scarlet fever on the 22nd of August 1867, when she was aged just 4. Life in 19th century Australia posed formidable challenges, particularly for those families residing in rural farming regions. They grappled with the demanding rigours of agricultural labour, faced restricted access to doctors and medicine, and endured the isolation imposed by their remoteness from larger communities. Things became even more desperate for Ellen when on the 20th of May 1871, after 9 years of marriage, her husband died. The terrible loss of William left her with the heavy burden of providing for her children. Her quest for financial security led her to far north Queensland, where the discovery of gold promised newfound opportunities. Determined and resolute, she packed her belongings and journeyed to Cooktown in the hope of finding work. However, life here proved far more challenging than she had ever imagined. It was not a place where many women had travelled, and Ellen assisted in nursing sick miners, many who were suffering from respiratory issues and insect-borne infections. But she worked hard in order to try and make enough money to look after herself and her children. In 1877, the township of Port Douglas emerged as a pivotal settlement in far north Queensland. Its establishment was primarily driven by the region's significant gold discoveries, particularly in the Hodgkinson River goldfields. This new township served as a vital gateway for gold prospectors, miners, and settlers who sought to capitalise on the abundant mining opportunities in the area. People also went there to farm, and among the first to secure land was Mr. William Thompson, also known as Billy. He possessed a somewhat demanding and uncompromising demeanour, but was undeniably diligent and hardworking. In 1878, Ellen accepted a position as housekeeper for Mr. Thompson. He was 24 years her senior, and despite his steadfast and resolute attitudes, they seemed to get on. Their relationship took an unexpected turn when in 1880, Ellen discovered that she was again with child and gave birth to a daughter, who she named Helen. Of course, her employer, Mr. William Thompson, was the baby's father, and now having a child of his own, he seemed to become less aggressive and for a while was far more considerate towards her. Helen was, however, an illegitimate child, as her mother had given birth outside wedlock, something that at the time still carried a strong social stigma. Not wanting to be the father of an illegitimate daughter, William asked Ellen to marry him. Although there was the considerable age difference, Ellen was very familiar with the hardship that she had endured trying to raise her children on her own, so accepted his proposal. She hoped to be able to provide a more stable life for her family. However, the marriage quickly soured and became marred by violence. Authorities intervened to protect Ellen and her children from William's temper. One child was removed due to concerns about their living conditions. Another was relocated following verbal abuse. A third found work helping build roads, and one of Ellen's daughters left the house after her stepfather had thrown a kerosene lamp at her when she objected to his proposal that she marry his brother, who was already in his 50s. When Ellen tried to intervene, he hurled a knife at her. William also harboured strong prejudices against the couple's Chinese neighbours. His harsh and derogatory words towards them further fueled tension between the couple. Eventually, Ellen moved into a different establishment, but she remained married and was aware that upon her husband's death, she would inherit his property. So in order to ensure that the farm continued to prosper, she started to work in the sugarcane fields. It was during these laborious days that she met Mr. John Harrison, a man who was originally from the small village of West Rainton in County Durham in north-east England, and who had deserted the Royal Marines. He had only been in Australia for a short while and was now working on a nearby property. He was much younger than Ellen, having been born in 1859, but they seemed to get on very well, and shortly after they first met, rumours began to circulate within the community that they were engaged in an improper relationship. William was made aware of all the local gossip and became increasingly more suspicious of the attention that Mr. John Harrison seemed to pay his wife. After a while, he confronted him and shouted, "Jack, why do you come here hawking the old woman about the place like this every day for?" The fact that he had angered Mr. Thompson did not seem to deter Mr. John Harrison, and rumours about his relationship with Ellen continued. Eventually, Mr. Thompson became so fed up with his wife being the subject of speculation and innuendo that he challenged Mr. Harrison to a duel. He called out to him, "The best man should keep the old woman." The majority of people just dismissed these impassioned outbursts as the ramblings of a grumpy old man. However, some did express concern about Mr. William Thompson's state of mind and wondered if he had lost his sanity. On the 22nd of October 1886, Mr. Thompson was discovered on the floor of his house. Next to him was his gun, and there was a bullet wound in his head. Although he was still alive, he was unable to speak, and later that night, he died. An unmistakable sense of shock and confusion followed, as neighbours soon appeared to offer their condolences to the deceased man's widow. People knew that Mr. William Thompson was a volatile character, and some had been concerned about his mental state, so it did not seem suspicious that his life had ended by his own hand. It wasn't long before the authorities were alerted to the grim scene, and Ellen was asked to make a statement. This she dictated to the police. She was unable to write it herself, as she was in fact illiterate. In the statement, she told officers that she believed that her husband had not been well for some time and had taken his own life. The police initially believed this to be true, but her choice of words left lingering questions unanswered, and although there was no incriminating evidence, there were those who contemplated the disturbing prospect that Mr. William Thompson's death might not have been a simple act of suicide. They had concerns that his demise may have been caused by either an accidental discharge or, more ominously, a deliberate act. In the weeks that followed the tragic incident, Ellen seemed to grapple with a mixture of grief and the pressing need to carry on with her own responsibilities. She busied herself with the daily tasks of running the farm and was now assisted by a newly employed worker, Mr. John Harrison. As the days turned into weeks, they were seen in each other's company far more frequently, and people were again gossiping about the nature of their relationship. The authorities soon learned that Mr. Thompson's tragic demise had once more become the main topic of conversation within the small community, and after hearing that his widow had been talked about in such a manner, they decided to keep a watchful eye on both Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Harrison. It was apparent that the tide of suspicion was turning as the peculiar circumstances surrounding the death began to cast a shadow of doubt over the initial suicide theory. It was not just a matter of uncertainty, but a growing conviction among the authorities that there was more to the tragic story. Several key factors, including the relentless pressure from Mr. Thompson's resolute brother. He adamantly believed that William's upcoming business appointments in Port Douglas, scheduled for the day after his death, defied the notion of suicide. Also, some of the townsfolk in Port Douglas, who accepted that William was a volatile character, found it hard to believe that he had died by his own hands. As this scepticism took root, more people wondered if something far more complex was at play. Consequently, on the 6th of January 1887, Mrs. Ellen Thompson and Mr. John Harrison were arrested on board the steamer Glanworth during their voyage back to Port Douglas from the bustling town of Townsville. They had apparently been to see a lawyer. Both were questioned, but denied that they had had any part in the death of William Thompson. Eventually, the authorities decided to exhume Mr. Thompson's body. Surgeons examined the skull, sifting through the fragments of evidence that could shed light on the circumstances surrounding the manner in which he had died. Their findings were both perplexing and disconcerting, as they challenged the initial assumption that death had been caused by a single gunshot. Instead, they concluded that Mr. Thompson had been shot not once, but twice, and this raised new questions about the manner in which he died. Mrs. Ellen Thompson and Mr. John Harrison were charged with murder. The trial took place in Townsville on the 3rd of May 1887, and both Ellen and John pleaded not guilty. Throughout the ordeal, both remained steadfast in their claims of innocence. Ellen vehemently asserted that she had had no hand in her husband's death, maintaining that she was wrongfully accused. The prosecution painted a starkly different picture, alleging that Ellen and John Harrison had conspired to kill her husband in an act motivated by financial gain. However, the defence pointed out that the majority of William Thompson's estate had not been left to his wife, but to his brother. As the trial unfolded, Ellen faced many accusations and insinuations. Inside the courtroom, she was labelled a loose woman, her character smeared in a bid to paint her as morally suspect. The spotlight fell on John Harrison, portrayed as her latest romantic interest, and the press wasted no time in casting Ellen as a scarlet woman, a figure of scandal and intrigue. As the legal proceedings continued, a lingering suspicion crept into the minds of some observers. They couldn't help but wonder if the verdict had been premeditated long before the trial commenced. The air was thick with doubts, and the scales of justice seemed unevenly balanced. A staggering 197 depositions were presented on behalf of the Crown, a formidable array of evidence that appeared to stack the odds against the two defendants. It became increasingly clear that they were facing an uphill battle, as their defence weakened by the weight of the prosecution case. Perhaps even more disconcerting was the unsettling revelation that some witnesses may have been swayed by financial incentives in order to try to ensure a conviction. There were those who questioned if the very integrity of the case against the defendants had been compromised. The trial lasted for 3 days, and despite its perplexing nature, the jury delivered a decisive verdict: guilty. Ellen Thompson became the first and only woman in Queensland history to be sentenced to hang. The judgment sent shockwaves, not only throughout Queensland, but throughout the whole of Australia. As the judge pronounced her sentence, Ellen was given the chance to speak. Her response was a passionate and emotional outpouring of her innocence. She spoke of her profound grief over losing her husband, and again denied any involvement in his murder. Ellen accused witnesses of lying, and suggested that her husband had been suicidal, while also insinuating that their Chinese neighbours may have played a sinister role in his death. Following the verdict, Ellen was trapped in a dreadful predicament, her reputation tarnished, and her life hanging in the balance. As the date of her execution approached, she resorted to desperate measures. She arranged for a prison officer to write heartfelt letters on her behalf to the Queensland Governor, pleading for mercy. She solemnly swore by her husband's memory that she was innocent. John Harrison, on the other hand, seemed to have a different disposition. On the night before his execution, he allegedly made a shocking confession to a jailer. In hushed tones, he admitted the terrible truth that he had killed William Thompson. He described a series of failed attempts to poison him and a violent altercation that ended with the fatal gunshots, and all the time he was being encouraged by Ellen to kill her husband. It was a chilling revelation. He even confirmed that he had never actually cared for Ellen and was only ever interested in the farm and the sugarcane. On the 13th of June 1887, Mrs. Ellen Thompson and Mr. John Harrison faced their final reckoning as they were led to the gallows at Bogger Road Jail. In her last moments, Ellen held fast to her claim of innocence, her voice unwavering. She said, "I am innocent." Then, standing on the brink of her own mortality, she said her last words, "I die like a wounded angel." For case number 2, we go to early 20th century Malaysia. British Malaya loosely describes a set of states on the Malay Peninsula and the island of Singapore that were brought under British control between the late 18th and the mid-20th century. However, Malaya was never colonised. The rulers of the Malay states maintained sovereignty. Britain was only in control of the administration. Nevertheless, Malaya was very important to Britain. By the end of the 19th century, the Malay states produced more than half of the world's tin, and by the early 20th century was also the world's largest natural rubber producer. During this period, the British set up schools, many of which were attended by the sons and daughters of British soldiers, government officials, and employees of large British companies. And some of these schools were very prestigious. Mr. William Proudlock worked in one such school, the renowned Victoria Institute for Boys, a secondary school that was founded in 1893. William joined the staff in 1901 when he was still only 20 years old. He had been personally asked to teach there by the headmaster, Mr. Bennett E. Shaw, when the gentleman had been on a mission to recruit staff while on home leave in England. The school was in Kuala Lumpur, which at the time was a relatively new city, estimated to have been established in 1857 as an important site for the tin industry. It quickly grew, and by 1887 had become the capital of the province of Selangor. In 1896, Kuala Lumpur became the capital of the recently formed Federal Malay States. The city's population quickly increased, mainly due to the rapidly expanding rubber industry, which by the early 1900s was in much demand, as rubber was needed for tyres for the new automobile industry. Kuala Lumpur attracted many businessmen and merchants, many of who needed to find good schools for their children. William Proudlock married 19-year-old Ethel Charter in April 1907 at the city's St Mary's Church. They had a quiet, understated ceremony, despite the fact that in the early 20th century, an expat wedding was often the cause of lavish celebrations. Instead of wearing a traditional white dress, Ethel chose to wear an electric blue one. Within an hour of the reception, the happy couple had set sail for England on their honeymoon. Many speculated that the reason for this was that she was trying to hide the fact that she was pregnant. Even in the Edwardian era, it was frowned upon for a young lady to be pregnant before being married. Ethel, however, was not the typical expatriate. She was in fact illegitimate, following a relationship between her father and a local woman. On her birth certificate, Mr. Robert Charter was named as her father, but there was no mother listed. She was raised by her father and his wife. However, Mrs. Charter seemed to resent Ethel and never accepted her as her child. After 9 months in England, the couple returned to Kuala Lumpur. It was now January 1908, and it seemed that all the speculation that had surrounded the couple's marriage was probably correct, as whilst away, Ethel had given birth to a daughter, who they named Dorothy. William continued to work in the school and progressed to the position of deputy headmaster. He lived with his family in an area known as Brickfields. However, in the year 1910, when Mr. Bennett Shaw returned to England, William was given the role of acting headmaster, and along with his wife and daughter, moved into the headmaster's bungalow. This was a large single-storey wooden building with a veranda that surrounded it. At the back was the Klang River, and at the front was a 5-foot high hedge. It was located at one end of the school playing field, which was situated between the bungalow and a very busy street. Fortunately, this was far enough away that the Proudlocks were not disturbed by the noise. The days were hot and humid. As the climate was tropical, there were no distinct seasons, and very little variation in temperature. April 1911 was a particularly hot period. The sun would shine most of the day, with the occasional shower. Ethel, however, was used to the weather. She often stayed at home while William was at work, and was assisted by her servants, who lived behind the property. On the evening of the 23rd of April 1911, Mr. William Proudlock attended a dinner with another member of staff, leaving his wife Ethel at home in the bungalow. That night, however, Ethel received a visitor, a 34-year-old bachelor named William Crozier Stewart. Mr. Stewart was a mining consultant and former manager of the Salak South tin mine. That day he had visited a rubber estate, but had declined an invitation to dine, stating that he had an important appointment in Kuala Lumpur. Later he dined with a friend, but left at 9 p.m, again stating that he had an appointment. He travelled to the Proudlock residence by rickshaw. This was a common mode of transport in Asia in the early 1900s, and a form of employment for male labourers. A rickshaw is a 2 or 3 wheeled passenger cart that is pulled by one person. Generally, only one passenger travelled in a rickshaw at a time. When the rickshaw arrived at the bungalow, Mr. Stewart requested that the boy wait behind the hedge, while he stopped for a quick visit. He said that he would soon be out, and would need to be taken back into the city. A few minutes later, the boy heard gunshots. He then saw Mr. Stewart stumble down the steps and collapse onto the ground. His lower body was on the driveway, and his upper body was lying on the grass. As the boy looked in silence, he saw a lady approach. She had a gun in her hand, scared of what might happen to him. The boy ran off in the direction of the gates. As he did, he heard 4 more shots. One of Mrs. Proudlock's servants heard the noise and rushed to see what was happening. When they saw Mrs. Proudlock with a revolver in her hand, they immediately sent for the lady's husband, Mr. William Proudlock. He quickly returned and found his wife in a state of shock, sitting on the veranda. The police also arrived. They found Mr. Stewart's body about 20 or 30 paces from the bungalow. He had been shot through the heart. A subsequent post-mortem conducted by Dr. Cooper, the chief medical officer at the General Hospital, discovered 5 other bullet wounds in the back of Mr. Stewart's neck, jaw and skull. Mrs. Ethel Proudlock was arrested and charged with murder. The trial sparked great interest, both in Malay and in Great Britain. The young rickshaw driver gave evidence. He told of how he had heard gunshots. He then saw Mrs. Stewart stumble down the steps and collapse onto the ground. He confirmed that it was a defendant who he had seen looking down at Mr. Stewart. He said that he then ran off, and as he did, he heard 4 more shots. Mrs. Proudlock's husband, Mr. William Proudlock, told the court that when he returned home that evening, he found his wife very distressed, with blood on her cheek and her dress. He said that he asked her what had happened, and she replied that Mr. Stewart had arrived, as he said that he wanted to retrieve a book. When she had gone to fetch it, he encircled her and attempted to assault her. He added that his wife was on the veranda, which was in some disorder, and that she was speaking in a very incoherent manner. Mrs. Ethel Proudlock gave evidence in her own defence. She told the court that Mr. William Stewart arrived at the schoolhouse. and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, he attempted a gross familiarity. He then said, "You lovely girl," and "I love you," along with some other outrageous words. A struggle ensued, and Mr. Stewart turned off the lights. Mrs. Proudlock said that she attempted to reach for the light switch, but instead came across her husband's revolver. She said that she fired once, not to try and kill the gentleman, but to be clear of him. Mrs. Proudlock added that after this, she has no memory of what happened, and she only came around when she was on the veranda, holding the revolver. She immediately threw it down and asked one of her servants to call her husband, who was dining out with a friend. When he returned, Mrs. Proudlock said that she shouted, "Blood, blood, I have shot a man." She said that the shooting of Mrs. Stewart was done solely in self-defence. During the trial, it was pointed out by the prosecution that Mr. William Stewart was shot on the veranda, indicating that he was leaving the bungalow at the time. Furthermore, he had asked the rickshaw boy to wait for him, so he clearly didn't expect to be there for very long. But this wasn't all the prosecution brought to light. They claimed that the defendant, Mrs. Ethel Proudlock, and the deceased gentleman, Mr. William Stewart, were in fact lovers. They claimed that Mrs. Proudlock was a difficult and hysterical lady, and that as William Stewart had started a relationship with a Chinese woman, he had come to the bungalow that night to end the affair. Mrs. Proudlock had then murdered him in a jealous rage. The press came up with a number of different theories, speculating that Mrs. Proudlock may have invited Mr. Stewart to the bungalow that night with the sole purpose of murdering him. Or perhaps he had indeed gone there to officially end the relationship, as the prosecution stated, and so outraged that he would do such a thing, she shot him. They also put forward the idea that perhaps Ethel had a second lover who was at the bungalow when William arrived, and who was responsible for shooting him. Ethel then took the blame for it. The press suggested this mystery man may have swam across the river behind the bungalow to escape detection. However, it is questionable whether this could have happened. It was night time, and the river was full of crocodiles. To swim across it would have been very risky, and the chances of making it to the other side alive would have no doubt been very low. However, Ethel refuted all these claims. She maintained her innocence and denied any suggestion that she may have been involved in an improper relationship with Mrs. Stewart. She only said that she shot him to protect her honour. There was no jury, and the case was heard by a judge and 2 assessors. The trial lasted for 10 days, and on the 22nd of June 1911, the judge found Mrs. Ethel Proudlock guilty of the murder of Mr. William Stewart. The judge said that there were inconsistencies in her testimony, and other circumstantial evidence pointed to her intentionally murdering the gentleman. He then sentenced her to death. The verdict was widely reported, but was overshadowed, as on the same day, King George V was crowned King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions and Emperor of India in a ceremony that took place at Westminster Abbey in London. However, many people in the local community were very angry with the judge's decision, resulting in the newspaper, the Malay Mail, to issue the following notice: "We decline to associate ourselves with the hysterical outbursts which have followed the judicial decision. Correspondence has already appeared in our columns touching upon the case, and the opinions of our readers will receive publicity within limits. But for those of you who have gone to all kinds of adjectival extremes in order to attempt to splutter forth their wrath against the judge and assessors, it may be added that their effusions will find the oblivion of the waste paper basket." Ethel Proudlock was sent to the Poudre prison to await her execution. In 1911, this was considered a relatively modern building. It had been built in phases by the British colonial government between 1891 and 1895. The cells were small and dark, each equipped with a window, which was the size of a shoebox. As the weeks passed, the opinion amongst the local residents seemed to be that Mrs. Proudlock had been treated harshly by the judge. They believed that she had acted in self-defence while defending her honour and called for her to be pardoned. Her husband, Mr. William Proudlock, wrote a number of letters demanding her release. In many of these, he criticised the Selangor government for the unfair way in which they had conducted the trial. He insisted that not only was the legal system defective, but there were also issues with the way in which the crime had been investigated. He criticised the Chief Commissioner's conduct and insisted that the gentleman had been entering the Selangor Club, telling everyone that Mrs. Proudlock would be strung up. Certainly not a very good example of a member of the law enforcement acting in an impartial manner. Mr. Proudlock also claimed that his servants had been beaten by the police as they did not answer their questions in a way that would incriminate his wife. But despite this, Ethel remained in prison, awaiting her appeal. During this time, several petitions were started, asking for her to be pardoned. These included one from her husband and the boys who attended the Victoria Institute. On Saturday the 8th of July 1911, against the advice of British advisers, the Sultan granted Mrs. Ethel Proudlock a pardon on the condition that she leave Malaya. She immediately left for England with her daughter. William Proudlock was sued by the police for libel, as he had insisted that they had beaten his servants when they would not agree to give incorrect evidence against his wife. He lost the case and lost his teaching position. He then returned to England. However, he continued to fight, writing many letters to the Colonial Office, criticising the investigation into the events of the 23rd of April 1911 and the terrible treatment of his wife. William believed that she had only been prosecuted as she was Eurasian, and if she had been born to a British mother and a British father, the case would never have gone to trial. William and Ethel did not live in England for very long. They moved to Canada in 1913, but did not stay together. 3 years later, Ethel moved to the United States. In 1931, William accepted a job at St. George College in Argentina. He died in 1958 at the age of 77. In 1944, Ethel remarried, and in 1950 moved to Florida, where she died in 1974 at the age of 88. Her daughter Dorothy eventually settled in Miami, where she died in 1990, aged 83. She never married or had any children. In the 1920s, writer Somerset Maugham heard about the case of Ethel Proudlock from her lawyer and decided to write a fictional version of it, called The Letter. The story was later adapted into a play and then a film. Following this, the incident at the headmaster's bungalow on the 23rd of April 1911 was largely forgotten about and never talked about in the Victorian Institute. That was until 1999, when a book titled Murder on the Veranda and written by Eric Lawler was published. In 1957, Malaya became independent and was known as the Independent Federation of Malaya. In 1963, the federation was renamed Malaysia. For the third case, we go to early 20th century USA. George Bailey was born in the small town of Whitefield in Lincoln County in Maine. When he finished his schooling, he started to work, and when still just a young man, married a lady from Lynn in Massachusetts. They lived together in the town of Alna in Maine, where George's wife gave birth to 2 children before tragedy struck and the poor young lady died. In the wake of his wife's passing, George found himself engulfed in an overwhelming tide of grief. Left with 2 young children, he faced the challenges of single parenthood, dealing with the new reality of raising them alone. Unable to do this, he married again, this time to a young woman named Miss Abby Hilton, who came from the nearby town of Wiscasset. Here, George began to work as a blacksmith, and over the next few years, Abby gave birth to 4 children. The marriage, however, faced many troubles, and in the spring of 1897, George abandoned his family as he started a relationship with Miss Susie Young, his wife's half-sister. This abrupt departure left Mrs. Abby Bailey in a difficult predicament. Seemingly deserted by her husband, she was now tasked with providing for herself and 6 children. To ensure their well-being amidst the upheaval, she made the heart-wrenching decision to place them with families in Whitefield and Wiscasset. Despite the adversity, she eventually secured employment as a housekeeper. Anxious to move away from the town and the complications associated with leaving his wife, in the company of Miss Young, George went to live in Saugus, at the residence of a gentleman named Mr. Henry O'Mitchell. However, in October of 1897, the opportunity arose for him to take the lease on Breakheart Hill Farm, an 18-acre property nestled within the vast Breakheart Hill forest. This had been made possible through the Forestry Association based in Lynn, on the condition that he agreed to take on the responsibility of overseeing the hunting camps within the forest, which would earn him a modest but welcome income of 20 cents per hour. Over the next 2 years, things seemed to be going quite well for Mr. George Bailey and Miss Susie Young. In the year 1899, a man named Mr. John Courtney Best was employed to assist on the farm. Mr. Best was born on the 8th of April 1865 in the town of Sackville in New Brunswick. Growing up as one of 9 children, his early years were a blend of structured schooling until the age of 12 and hands-on farm labour that installed a robust work ethic. During these years, his exceptional talent as a marksman set him apart and earned him much recognition in the community. Following his education, he worked for 10 years on a farm that was owned by Mr. Alfred Ayres, who was a very good friend of his father. However, farm labour did not pay very well, and in an attempt to earn more money, he started to explore alternative employment opportunities. Over the next few years, he worked in a shoe factory, a grocery store, and a local Sackville hotel. The turning point in John Best's life unfolded in 1891 when his sister, Mrs. Nettie Stiles, made a journey back to her hometown of Sackville from the home she shared with her husband in Lynn. She told her brother about the factories and industry in the town and suggested that John join her on the return trip. He agreed, and once in Lynn, decided to stay. He soon found employment at J.B. Renton, a heel manufacturer, and it seemed that everything was going well for him. However, the year 1898 brought unforeseen challenges as John faced assault charges, resulting in a 4-month sentence, which he served at the Salem House of Correction. Undeterred, upon his release, he returned to Lynn, finding employment at a different heel manufacturer. Eventually, however, he returned to work at J.B. Renton until the factory workers went on strike in 1899. At the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, labour unions in the United States of America were on the rise. They addressed such things as lengthy work hours and inadequate pay. However, at the time, the legal environment was not particularly favourable to the unions. Court decisions often reflected a tendency to side with the employers, limiting the ability of workers to organise a strike. Additionally, anti-union sentiments among some segments of the public and policymakers further complicated the effort of the unions. However, the workers at J.B. Renton's did strike, which left employees relying on the little amount of strike pay they received. And like many of the people who worked there, John Courtney Best faced financial hardship as he was now left without an adequate income. This is why during the strike, he managed to secure employment at the modest Breakheart Hill farm owned by Mr. George Bailey. His tenure at the farm spanned a month until the strike concluded, prompting his return to J.B. Renton's. By May 1900, disenchanted with the industrial setting, he wholeheartedly embraced full-time farm work with Mr. Bailey. The two men agreed that Mr. Best would do half the cultivating on the farm in exchange for a room to sleep and half the profits from the crops. Amidst the picturesque landscape of Breakheart Hill, a complex relationship started to unfold between George Bailey, Susie Young, and John Best. On the surface, the trio projected an image of unity, working side by side, yet beneath the facade of tranquility simmered some unspoken tensions. Mr. Best expressed misgivings about Mr. Bailey's treatment of the farm animals and questioned the transparency of his financial dealings. Mr. Bailey in turn levelled accusations at Mr. Best, citing perceived laziness and an apparent struggle with alcohol. The intricacies of these dynamics were revealed through Mr. Bailey's strategic management of Mr. Best's finances. Pay was not promptly issued, but rather tactically delayed until after the sale of crops, a move calculated to prevent Mr. Best's earnings from being squandered at the local saloon. George Bailey carefully allocated limited funds for farm equipment, recognising Mr. Best's propensity to dissipate money on less productive pursuits. The situation was far from good. It was one of unresolved grievances, financial issues, and the disagreements that harmed their interactions. It was also detrimental to the prosperity of the farm. On the 27th of September 1900, Miss Young left Breakheart Hill to attend her sick mother in Wiscasset. George Bailey chose not to join her, his reluctance rooted in the circumstances of his previous hasty departure from the town. Instead, she went alone, accompanied by her young son. Consequently, George Bailey and John Best found themselves trying to work together without the calming influence of Miss Young. Everything seemed to be peaceful until Monday the 8th of October. That night brought unexpected disturbances. Between 9:30 and 9:40 p.m, 2 distinct gunshots pierced the air. At approximately 10 p.m, Hannah Hawkes, an elderly resident who lived on the road that led to the farm, heard the hurried departure of a carriage coming in the direction of her house from the farm. Later that night, she was stirred from her sleep by the return of the carriage, echoing a mysterious journey under the cover of darkness. Further afield in Lynn, Mrs. Aura Bede, who resided near Floating Bridge Pond, encountered an unusual episode at around 1:30 a.m. The rhythmic rattle of a wagon drew her attention, and as she got up, she observed it passing her home. The distinct sound of horse hooves on the bridge planks accompanied the wagon until it reached the midpoint. After a 5-minute silence, she heard the horse being driven back over the bridge, followed by the return of the wagon past her house. The peculiar noise it made when passing suggested that it may have had a loose wheel. The following day, Tuesday the 9th of October, Mr. Bailey was nowhere to be seen. Seemingly worried about his whereabouts, Mr. Best went to the homes of his neighbours, Sarah Rowe, Simon McCanna and Annie Dwyer, to ask if they had seen him. A sense of unease accompanied his inquiries, his words carrying the weight of concern. He told them that Mr. Bailey had not been seen since 8 o'clock the previous evening. Meanwhile, Mr. James W. Thomas had noticed a bonfire in the yard at Breakheart Hill Farm. Although not unheard of, it was quite unusual for a fire to be so close to the house. He went to investigate, and as the flames flickered, he noticed what appeared to be the fragment of a horse blanket hidden in the embers. Adding to the unfolding mystery were the keen observations of Johnny Mitchell and Wyn Rowe, the farm's young assistants. They had already noted that 2 horse blankets were missing, which was very strange, as they were always kept in the same place. Though no official report was filed, news of Mr. George Bailey's disappearance soon spread throughout the area. Mr. Clough, a co-owner of the property, caught wind of these rumours. Speculation swirled, with some claiming that Mr. Best, now left alone at the farm, was neglecting the livestock due to frequent intoxication. Fueled by a mix of curiosity and concern, Mr. Clough visited the property and engaged in a direct conversation with Mr. Best. In a candid exchange, Mr. Best put forth the notion that Mr. Bailey had fled, alleging a looming arrest for abandoning his wife and 6 children. On the 17th of October, the stillness of Floating Bridge Pond was shattered by a macabre discovery. A man's torso, concealed within a bag. 2 bullet holes had pierced the body. Suspicion lingered in the air, a whisper that this gruesome find might be Mr. George Bailey. The police went straight to Breakheart Hill Farm to speak with Mr. John Best. They asked him to return with them to the station and gave him the haunting task of trying to identify the body. Yet before undertaking this sombre duty, he produced a partially filled pint of whiskey and swiftly consumed its contents, perhaps a frantic indulgence in drink in order to help confront his approaching sadness. With trepidation, Mr. Best confirmed that the clothing draped over the unfortunate corpse had belonged to Mr. George Bailey. The day unfolded further when the legs of the ill-fated man were found. Saugus Police Chief Charles Thompson later confirmed Mr. Best's identification and with eerie precision matched the corpse's height, hair colour and shoe size to that of the missing Mr. Bailey. The ominous saga deepened as a shoemaker named Mr. Darius W. Brewer lent his expertise to the grim discovery, attesting that the shoes belonged without doubt to Mr. George Bailey, adding a poignant touch. A small watch bag that had been meticulously crafted by Miss Young was discovered on the body. As the bags that had covered Mr. Bailey's remains were unveiled, a chilling revelation emerged. They bore the distinct imprint of the company IHS and Sons, with the words Hay and Grain written upon them. This was the very supplier constantly favoured by George Bailey. Upon investigation at the farm, the police encountered a series of hauntingly identical bags, casting a sinister shadow over the landscape and deepening the mystery surrounding Mr. George Bailey's tragic demise. George Neal from Massachusetts State Police spearheaded the investigation with the assistance of officers from Lynn and Sargus. Following the identification of the body, police sought permission from Mr. Best to search the house, a request to which he agreed, and provided them with lanterns for the task. In the course of the search, a profound discovery unfolded. One of the 2 bullets, retrieved from the body, matched the barrel of a rifle unearthed at the farmhouse. Analysis of the firearm suggested that there had been a recent discharge. However, Mr. Best insisted that the gun had accidentally gone off approximately 1 week prior. A more meticulous examination of the house brought to light unsettling details, including bloodstains on the carpet, wallpaper, and the windowsill of Mr. Best's bedroom. When questioned about these ominous marks, Mr. Best assured the officers that they had been present since he had moved in. In light of these findings, Mr. John Best was arrested on suspicion of murder. The following day added another layer to the enigma as the police noticed the deliberate removal of several stones from the wall. Remarkably, these stones mirrored both the colour and geological composition of those that had been placed in the bags used to weigh down Mr. Bailey's body. On the 18th of October, Dr. Pinkman determined the murder date as the 8th of October. He made this assumption based on the deceased man's stomach contents. Bullet trajectory suggested a seated Mr. Bailey was shot at a 45-degree angle. Dr. Pinkman added that internal bleeding might explain why no blood was found at the site of the shooting. However, he went on to say that the area where the limbs were severed would have been covered in blood. So with this information, the police decided to focus on finding this location. A cartridge found under a barn window supported the theory that Mr. Bailey was shot while seated in his wagon. Later, however, after discovering Mr. Bailey's overcoat in his bedroom, the police shifted the theory and decided that the shooting took place in the kitchen. Later, the theory changed again when it was proposed that Mr. Bailey was shot climbing the barn cellar stairs. Miss Young returned from Maine on the 22nd of October, her grief very evident. She spoke to detectives. She pointed out the bloodstains on the floor and the walls of the storeroom and said that they were not present when she departed. She told the officers that it seemed as though someone had recently cleaned the floor. When the police looked at the area, they suspected that it must have been where Mr. Bailey's body was dismembered. The trial of Mr. John Courtney Best commenced on the 18th of March 1901, and an air of anticipation filled the courtroom, with the press and the public captivated by the proceedings. However, it was not until the 5th day of this riveting legal spectacle that the narrative took a compelling turn. Mr. William H. Stiles, the brother-in-law of the accused, stepped into the witness box, revealing a conversation he had had with the defendants. He said that Mr. Best had disclosed the existence of hidden property, including a watch, stowed away in the barn's basement. He added that his brother-in-law had asked him to fling it away as far as he could at the low water mark. Mr. Stiles went on to say that Mr. Best did not say to who the watch had belonged, but had mentioned that if it was found, it would lead to his downfall. After this surprising revelation, law enforcement promptly proceeded to Breakhart Hill Farm. After a search, they found there, hidden among the rafters, a parcel meticulously wrapped in newspaper which contained a valuable gold watch, $75 in cash, a pocket knife, and a fragment of a leather coat, reminiscent of Mr. Bailey's attire on the day of his demise. A gentleman named Mr. Oakes M. Palmer, who was a reputable watchmaker from Pittston in Kennebec County in Maine, provided testimony indicating that the serial number on the watch matched that of a timepiece that Mr. Bailey had entrusted him to repair twice in 1891. In response to inquiries about the watch, Mr. Best told the court that he only acquired it after Mr. Bailey had disappeared. He insisted that the deceased man had owed him money, and he viewed this as the only way of recovering the debt. The trial reached its conclusion on the 28th of March. The press and the public eagerly awaited the jury's verdict. After 6 hours of anticipation, the jury returned to declare the defendant, Mr. John Courtney Best, guilty of the murder of Mr. George Bailey, and the judge sentenced him to death. There were the usual appeals, but they were all rejected. On the 28th of August 1902, Mr. John Courtney Best was transferred from Salem Jail to Charlestown State Prison. His execution took place there on the 9th of September, during which time he maintained his composure and refrained from uttering any final words. A letter he had written to his parents shortly before his execution was revealed to the public on September the 20th. In the letter, he detailed the state of his personal matters and once again asserted his innocence. For the fourth case, we go to 19th century Argentina. Clorinda Saracan was born in 1830 in Buenos Aires, the capital city of Argentina, a country that covers much of the southern portion of the continent of South America and is the world's 8th largest country. In 1830, Buenos Aires was still quite small, and many of its inhabitants lived in rural communities on the outskirts of the city centre. Clorinda's family, however, were considered to be well off and lived in one of the more affluent areas. Her parents made sure that their children were educated, and Clorinda learnt all the social graces associated with a young lady in the first part of the 19th century. She was considered to be quite beautiful, and her family were anxious that she should marry well to further improve their circumstances. In order to keep the wealth within a small number of families, it was usual that the marriages of the young ladies and gentlemen from the higher social circles were arranged by their parents. And now that Clorinda was 15 years old, Senor Saracan started to look for a suitable husband for his daughter. The country had not had a very stable economy since the 1820s, when the government borrowed heavily to finance new projects and to pay off war debts. The currency, the peso, then began to lose some of its value. There had been a new currency crisis in 1838 and 1839, and now in 1845, the peso was again not doing well. Neither was Argentina's economic performance. The economic situation in Argentina made it even more important for Senor Saracan to find an acceptable match for his daughter. He knew that he would have to be careful in his choice, as although the family were well off, they were not amongst the more elite families in Buenos Aires. He made the acquaintance of a very well-respected and wealthy gentleman by the name of Jacobo Fiorini, but he liked to be known simply as Fiorini. He was in his late 40s and was a talented portrait artist who had come to Argentina from the Italian city of Ferrara in the 1820s. He had travelled there with another Italian artist named Alessandro Succelli, and Fiorini belonged to a family of artists who had been famous in their region since the 15th century. Italian migration to Argentina was common at the time, especially to the capital, Buenos Aires. It is said that millions of Italians emigrated to Argentina in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Saracan family saw Senor Fiorini as an excellent prospect for their daughter, although Clorinda was disappointed that the match that they had arranged for her was to a man more than 30 years her senior. However, she had always known that arranged marriages with older, more financially established men was common practice, and young women were expected to accept this if they were to better their family status. In 1845, the date was set for the wedding, and in a splendid ceremony, 15-year-old Clorinda Sarachan married Signor Jacopo Fiorini. It was the first time that many of Fiorini's friends had met Clorinda, and they were all taken aback by her outstanding beauty. Clorinda and her new husband had a very comfortable life. They lived in a beautiful country estate on the outskirts of the city, in a town named Santos Lugares. Clorinda had servants who worked in the house, and a number of labourers who worked on the land. Her husband had established himself as one of the best portrait artists in Argentina. He had quite a famous art studio, and he painted the most remarkable portraits for prominent people, many of who were regarded to be the most renowned members of Buenos Aires society. But Fiorini was also a man of vision, as following the introduction of the first box cameras to Europe, an invention from a French engineer named Louis Daguerre, Fiorini realised that this could mean that far less people would commission his artwork, especially as the news of the camera had been reported all over Argentina. He knew that box photography would be far less expensive than commissioning a portrait, so he brought one of the cameras to his studio and offered the service of portrait photography as well as his portrait paintings. This also meant that his clients grew, as now it was not only the wealthiest people in the city that visited his studio. His business was now becoming so successful that he employed 2 assistants. Everyone seemed to be amazed by this new novel invention, and many people were intrigued to find out how it actually worked. And now, due to his increased success, Signor Fiorini became an even more well-known and more popular person in Buenos Aires. He was now taking photographs, not only of the very rich, but also people who lived in the more middle-class areas of the city. Even though he was already a very wealthy gentleman, now he had the photography studio. His income continued to increase, as did his fame. He was recognised by even more people as he went about his daily business. As he walked along the boulevards, people would whisper to each other that was Signor Fiorini, the famous artist and photographer, but Fiorini would usually just smile and continue walking. However, despite his success and increased wealth, his marriage to Clorinda was not a happy one. They had now been married for 10 years and had 5 children together, but Clorinda had become quite disenchanted with the famous artist. He seemed to always be in his photographic studio, while she stayed at the farm with the children. She was now 25 years old and thought that there were more interesting things that she could be doing, but her husband just kept on working. He was now a gentleman in his mid-60s, and he did not seem to be concerned that his wife may be discontented in her marriage. After all, she had 5 children to care for, and he provided her with a lovely house, servants, wealth, and a high social status. He believed that she should be happy with everything that he had given her. Soon after, rumours emerged that Clorinda had been seen out on a number of occasions in the company of a 25-year-old farm foreman named Crispin Gutierrez. Fiorini, however, did not seem very concerned. He had a successful art and photography studio to look after, and said that he had no time to worry about his wife's indiscretions. He thought that any relationship that she may be having would soon run its course. After all, he was just a poor worker. He was rough and unsophisticated, and Clorinda would soon tire of him. However, the relationship between Clorinda and the farm foreman continued. On the 9th of October 1856, Signor Fiorini decided that he had had enough of 25-year-old Crispin Gutierrez. It had become known throughout the city that the wife of the famous Signor Jacopo Fiorini was conducting a relationship with one of his employees. Now, when he walked along the boulevards of Buenos Aires, instead of people whispering that there was Signor Fiorini, the famous artist and photographer, they would now say that there was Signor Fiorini, whose wife is conducting a liaison with a farm manager. Fed up with being mocked, he went to the farm to confront Crispin Gutierrez. He told him that he either stopped the relationship with his wife or he would be dismissed from his position. Crispin, however, did not want to give up Clorinda. He was not ashamed of his behaviour, and instead of being respectful and agreeing to end the relationship, he became very angry. He told his master that he and Clorinda were in love and that he would do anything for her. He became very violent and even threatened to kill Signor Fiorini. Signor Fiorini was so frightened by the awful ordeal that he ran back to the house, where he took refuge in his bedroom and bolted the door. Later that afternoon, Clorinda went up to the bedroom. She told her husband that there was nothing to worry about. She said that Crispin had decided to leave altogether and would never be returning to the farm. Instead, he would find work in the city. Clorinda was very persuasive. She spoke very lovingly to her husband, and her words put his mind at rest. Eventually, he came out of the bedroom and went downstairs. She told him to sit down while she went to the kitchen and prepared them both something to eat. Signor Fiorini was still feeling a little anxious, but his wife soon made him feel at ease. However, he turned quickly as Clorinda left the kitchen and went towards the front door of the house. She opened it, and there outside was Crispin Gutierrez and his brother, named Remigio. Before Signor Fiorini could react, the two men were inside the house and started to attack him with wooden sticks. They repeatedly hit him in the head and then started to beat him with a clay pot. Eventually they shot him, and the famous artist and photographer, Signor Jacobo Fiorini, was dead. The brutal attack was witnessed by Clorinda, who throughout just stood and watched, never attempting to fetch help or assist her husband fend off the Gutierrez brothers. As Signor Fiorini lay dead, the house was a mess. There were pieces of broken clay pots on the floor and blood on the furniture and walls. Strangely, however, instead of Clorinda and the Gutierrez brothers cleaning everything up, Clorinda instructed the kitchen maids to do it. While they did this, the brothers carried Fiorini's body to the kitchen garden. They then dug a hole and buried him. Once he was buried, they planted some young cauliflowers on the soil, so it may look like a typical kitchen garden. After the murder, Clorinda, Crispin, and Remigio carried on living on the farm, and they went about their daily business as if nothing had happened. Although they were just acting normally, Fiorini's absence from his studio was soon noticed, and after he had not been seen for 2 weeks, his friends and business associates went to the farm to ask Clorinda if she knew why Fiorini had not been to work. Clorinda told them that she did not know where he was, as he rarely spoke to her about his business. She said that he had probably gone away to do a painting. After all, he was famous, and he may have been commissioned by a wealthy family in another part of Argentina. Her answers did not seem very plausible. He would not have just disappeared without telling someone where he was going. He always discussed what he was doing with his friends, so why would he have been so secretive this time? They also thought that Clorinda had seemed quite uninterested in her husband's whereabouts, and that she was very dismissive of their concerns. As Fiorini had not been seen for more than 2 weeks, and Clorinda did not seem at all worried, her husband's friends became somewhat suspicious. He was a well-known and well-liked person in Buenos Aires. He had fame and an established business, and it had become quite common knowledge that his young wife had been involved in a relationship with one of the farm workers. His friends decided to report the disappearance to the newspapers, so hopefully people would read the missing persons information and he would soon be found. However, he wasn't, and no one responded to the missing person inquiry. His friends then returned to the farm to speak to Clorinda, but again, her answers were vague, and she just said that she had no idea where her husband might have gone. Becoming more concerned, and even more suspicious that Clorinda knew more than she was letting on, the friends of Signor Fiorini contacted the police. The police went to the farm and spoke to Clorinda, but they found that she was not at all interested in her husband's whereabouts and was elusive in her answers to their questions. They would have to get a warrant to enter the farm. On the 29th of October, a judge of the Supreme Court issued a warrant which enabled the police and detectives to enter Signor Fiorini's property and interrogate the staff. When questioned, everyone said that they had not seen the master for about 4 weeks, and that they had no idea where he might have gone. The police, however, did not believe them. They knew that the staff were not telling the whole story. The workers were poor, and would have known that if anything happened to the mistress, they would not be paid, and it could be difficult for them to find employment. The police told them that they would all be taken into custody, and would remain there until someone told them the whereabouts of their master. But still, no one spoke. They were then all taken to the police station. Once there, however, they began to get quite nervous. Crispin Gutierrez was a man of very little education, and he believed that if he confessed, everything would be all right for him and all of the other staff members who were in police custody. So he told the officers the gruesome account of what had happened to Signor Fiorini on the 9th of October. He then showed them the place where the body was buried. The body of Jacopo Fiorini was then dug up and was given a proper burial where his friends and children could mourn his death. Clorinda and the Gutierrez brothers were all arrested and charged with murder. The trial was a sensation and began on the 19th of November 1856. Clorinda was represented by a bright young lawyer named Carlos Tejedor, who many years later would write the Argentinian Penal Code. In this case, however, he found it quite difficult to put a good argument to represent Clorinda, and instead shocked the court when he revealed that Senor Fiorini was not only Clorinda's husband, he was also her father, as he had once had an illicit relationship with the accused mother. The statement caused a stir amongst those present at the trial, but it was never confirmed that this was in fact true, and may have just been used to divert the attention away from her terrible crime. Despite this, the trio were sentenced to death by firing squads, and then their corpses were to be put on display for 12 hours at the Buenos Aires Plaza del Mayo. This was an act designed to deter other future criminals. As they waited for their execution dates, Remigio managed to escape the prison, but he was recaptured soon after. The sentences were to be carried out on the 4th of December, but as the day approached, Clorinda's lawyer told the magistrates that she was with child, so the execution would have to be delayed until after she had given birth. He was a very astute lawyer, and he managed to gain the sympathy of the public. During these months, a lady named Marquita Sanchez de Thompson, along with the Benevolent Society, arranged for a petition to be launched, asking that Clorinda be pardoned. The petition was signed by 7,000 people, which was substantial, considering that at the time, the population of Buenos Aires was only 90,000. Eventually, the sentences of Clorinda and the Gutierrez brothers were commuted to 10 years, although Clorinda did not serve all of this, as she was released early for good behaviour. Once released, she left Buenos Aires. She changed her name and disappeared from public notice. What happened to her after this is not known. She was the last woman to be sentenced to death in Argentina. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. And thank you to all of you who stayed to the end. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again next week for another brief case.